Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
Wednesday morning. We're midweek. We haven't done a Wednesday in a while.
That is right. I'm very tired. I was on Don Lemon's show last night until the wee hours.
and you came on only an hour or so, or 2 hours after this tape was released to CNN with Michael Cohen discussing payments with Trump. So were you prepared for that?
Yeah, I listen to CNN for a couple hours before I go on usually, so I was up to speed, and I got to hear, not only the news, and I heard the tape multiple times, but I also heard the different viewpoints of it, and I was able to formulate a take, which is, I don't think in and of itself this is that big of a deal, but it suggests to me that Michael Cohen was taping a lot of private conversations with Donald Trump. And I think there's 11 or 12 tapes, that are in existence. It sounds like Lanny Davis. How soon we forget, from the Clinton era. Lanny Davis is sort of managing Cohen's media campaign, and it seems like what they're trying to do is that they've given up on a pardon and they're trying to cut a deal with Mueller. I mean, that's my sort of gut from this. And so I don't think in and of itself, not that big of a deal. Like, people are saying, well, maybe it's proof of a campaign finance violation. Who knows? But to me, the big thing is, wow. I mean, we already knew that Michael Cohen had been taping Trump, but this is like proof that these tapes exist and that God knows what Donald Trump might have said on them.
I'm really flummoxed why the pardons haven't come sooner. I'm not Jeffrey Toobin. I'm not Dan Abrams. I'm not a legal expert. But my understanding is that he could pardon at any time for any reason. You could do a preemptive pardon,
right?
Why would you wait? I mean, if you don't want to wait till after the charges get filed and they've already talked. You want them to prevent them from talking. So why not just say right now, Michael Cohen is pardoned for all any potential crimes related to this investigation, and then he knows to keep those tapes in his back pocket. I mean, and this goes the same with Flynn and with Manafort. What's the point of waiting?
Not only have they not pardoned, they've not hinted that they're going to pardon, or they've hinted, but they've been very unclear about it, right? So if you're Paul Manafort, in some jail in an orange jumpsuit, or and Cohen sent signals. He was like, "Look, I've got to do what's best for my family." He went from talking about how he would take a bullet for Donald Trump to sort of being like, "Look, I gotta take care of my family. I got to do what's best for them." That would be a good signal for Donald Trump to signal that a pardon is coming. And yet, Rudy Giuliani has been very unclear about that, and I understand why. But and now I'm thinking Trump is probably ticked off at Cohen.
A bit.
So now Trump might not pardon him, even if it would.
What's the point now? The damage is done.
We don't know what but my assumption is that he has not given anything to Mueller yet, because he has not got.
I thought these tapes are already in their hands, or not Mueller's hands, but the U.S. Attorney's Office hands.
Yeah, that's a good point. You got me on that one, Bill. But see, that would have happened without the pardon anyway, right? Because they basically seized those documents in a raid of Cohen's motel room and house, right?
But if Cohen's pardoned, I mean, again, I don't know the specifics of what they're pursuing here, but I mean, this is technically separate from the Mueller case.
The other thing is that Trump waived the I'm sleep deprived here, guys. Trump waived, the right to say, look, this is my lawyer, this is confidential information, this can't be, they waived that. So it's an interesting thing again.
But but if he pardoned before Cohen released the tapes, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York would still have them, but they would know, I can't indict Cohen because he's pardoned.
Right.
So what's the point of pursuing this?
Well, who knows what's on the tapes? But
right, I mean, maybe there's something else that they would then pursue. But so I agreed that Trump can't stop the raid from happening, but I would think you would at least minimize the damage if everybody know everyone's pardoned here. No one, there's no crime. This is all a witch hunt, and I'm pardoning to shut this down as much as possible so we can get on with the business of governing the country. I
think the caveat here is obviously like that would be in a sense a legal form of obstruction of justice, and I mean I don't think either of us are rooting for that to happen. But what we're saying is like this is Trump. He already breaks all sorts of norms and already does a lot of damaging things. Why wouldn't he do this one? Like why is he not doing this norm-breaking activity,
I mean, the only
right? Like, why wouldn't you burn, if you're Nixon, why wouldn't you burn the tapes, kind of thing?
Well, Nixon, I believe, the whole tape mechanism was there as a record of history to vindicate himself in the future, so people would see what really happened, and no one could question, what was said. And it was only when his back was really up against the wall that those 18 minutes were erased. In Trump's case, the only explanation I can come up with, and again I can't obviously know, is he thinks that having a preemptive pardon is some sort of de facto admission of guilt, and he wants to be able to say there's nothing here, there's no reason for a pardon. But obviously the downside risk is that people who are getting squeezed by prosecutors are gonna talk.
Yes, and that's the thing. I mean, look, the media wants to make every one of these stories out to be like a bombshell revelation. And they're really not necessarily, but here's what we do know. We do know that very close Trump associates are being squeezed big time. Some of them were wearing wires. Some of them were wearing wires, that the FBI gave them, and some of them are wearing, had iPhones recording. But, I don't know if Trump is guilty, but if he is, it's gonna come out because, I mean, think of anybody. If you had, 4 of your closest associates and, a couple of them were, risking spending the next 30 years of their lives in jail or something, and had been recording you, if you're trying to hide something, it's going to come out.
I'm not one to pin my hopes on Tom Arnold. I've listened to his interviews recently.
What could go wrong with that?
He definitely seems like, he's not fully centered at this point in his life. But he did make one comment I thought was very insightful. Was that Trump? I think he said on his Politico podcast interview, the Politico Off Message podcast, he said Trump's a D-list person, and he has D-list enemies. And Cohen strikes me as sort of a D-list enemy. So obviously he's not the most credible figure, based on what he's done in the past, or has been alleged to do in the past, threatening folks and so on. But he's the kind of guy apparently that would tape his client.
Yeah.
And Trump seemed incredulous on Twitter today. What kind of guy tapes his client? Like the kind of guy you associate with?
No, it's a really scummy thing to do. I mean, I don't for a second believe that it was done for noble purposes. But let me ask you this: how is Tom Arnold now involved in this?
We started this show on Vice, The Hunt for the Trump Tapes, and he's playing a kind of it's sort of a flip side of what Trump did with the birther stuff. I know this stuff is out there. I've hired the private investigator to find the truth about Obama's birth. People are saying that there's something out there, and it was this game he was playing with the press which seemed sort of transparently phony from the outside, but obviously bonded him with a portion of the Republican base that helped bring him to the White House. Now, I don't think Tom Arnold's running for president, but he seems to be doing a similar game where he says he knows these tapes exist. He said he's heard something before, or he's heard from a friend of a friend that this thing is out there, and dadgummit, he's gonna find it.
Yeah. And you know what's horrible about this? I've been lamenting the politicization of politics for a long, I've been lamenting the, I guess, Hollywoodization of politics, right? Like the entertainment of it, for a long time. And mainly when people talk about that, they mean like the reality show aspect of it. But like there is the thing where this is the last refuge of scoundrels. If you are a like washed up actor, or if you're looking to, maybe you don't have that much talent, politics is like where people go now, right? Isn't it like isn't like making a political statement or being a political activist like a great way if you can't get anything else going? I know this doesn't say much about.
I think you could say
this doesn't say a lot about our careers, Bill, but isn't this sort of where they go, like when they can't do anything else?
I think you could say that about Jesse Ventura. You could say that about Arnold Schwarzenegger. You could say that about Ronald Reagan.
Bill. Now you've gone too far.
When the acting career started to sputter out, where does one go? Reagan shifted to doing the GE those GE shows and touring the GE plants, and parlayed that into a political career. Where does one take one's celebrity when they can't get on screen easily anymore? And politics is a great fallback.
Yes. Anyway, that is a thing that we're going to have to deal with. I mean, Donald Trump is a celebrity candidate as well.
So let me shift gears a little bit. We talked some last week about Trump's Helsinki performance and the Maria Butina case. I think it was 2 days ago or 3 days ago when the NBC Wall Street Journal poll came out, and it showed Trump had gone from 44% approval to 45% approval, and that was interpreted as nothing matters. He's publicly being Putin's stooge, and the base doesn't care, which conflicted with our conversation last week, where we know at least your mother was unnerved. Your mother is a Trump voter. And was very unnerved that Trump met with Putin without anyone else in the room. That struck a nerve with her. The NBC Wall Street Journal poll was taken between the 15th and the 18th, and the Helsinki press conference and the Butina indictment was on the 16th. So, in my mind, that wasn't a clear set of data to gauge reaction to those events. Now, since then, we've had, this came out yesterday, a Quinnipiac poll that showed him dropping from 40, he was at 40 in early July, down to 38. So again, not enormous movement, but still it's still within margin of error, but it's downward. And he was at 43 after the North Korean summit. That got, as controversial as that was, still was better press than the Putin summit. So I think the jury's still a little bit out as far as what the total reaction to all this is going to be. But I think it's going to be somewhat net negative. His hardcore base is hardcore, but even a slight decline from hardcore support is very problematic for him, because his base support is fairly tenuous in the first place, and the midterm election is not necessarily premised on his popularity, though it's a factor. He's not on the ballot. Right. Having said all that, I had a piece over the weekend about how the Republicans have an Alger Hiss problem, and the headline that Politico gave it was Republicans have an Alger Hiss problem named Maria, which is a play on that Sound of Music song. What do you do with a problem like Maria? And got a decent amount of attention over the weekend, if I may say. Most of the reaction I got on social media was positive, and coming from people who I think generally were on the left, which was evidence that I think the left has largely given up on defending Alger Hiss, which it might be a surprise to some on the right. I got a little bit of attention from people who were still Alger Hiss defenders, but mostly people didn't dwell on that.
Wasn't Don Imus like a big Alger Hiss defender in the 90s or something?
I was not an Imus fan. I was a Howard Stern guy in the 90s, so I don't listen to much Don Imus.
Well, I'm sure the commenters can weigh in.
But yesterday, Tuesday, one of the biggest conservative radio show hosts, Mark Levin, spent his
great one. Who is Bill Scher?
He spent his whole first hour of his show on the article. He read almost the entire article. He skipped over some key points. I'm not saying he gave it a fair reading, but he did read a lot of it. And then had a guest on to then further, trash me and trash the article, how there's no comparison. And part of the conceit here is, and I saw this a little bit on social media over the weekend, people focusing on the headline of the piece, which suggests I'm equating Butina with Hiss, which doesn't make sense because Butina is a Russian agent.
Yeah.
And
people need to know that we don't write the headlines or the deck. I had a piece a couple weeks ago, and by the way, I am in no way impugning the people who write the headlines, because I'm all for them writing headlines that get people to click. But there was one, what was it? What was the headline, the deck, the subheadline that you said was misspelled or something, Bill, that you corrected? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't remember.
It was like precedent schmecedent or something. Anyway, there was a piece where like the subheadline was written in the first person as if I said it, and it was like, it was like,
was it one of your Barrett columns?
Yeah, Amy Coney Barrett isn't the best, and I don't care. And right. I couldn't care. I forget what it was, but it was something that I never said. I'm not upset about it. People should know that like the people who write the columns usually do not write the titles or the headlines, and people who write them are trying to get people to click on them to get, I understand.
And this headline, Republicans have an Alger Hiss problem named Maria. It was a fantastic headline for getting people to click on the story.
I mean, I thank goodness for the people, the brilliant people who headline my pieces, because if I headlined them, nobody would read them. There's an art form to this, but sometimes it doesn't perfectly reflect the nuances and how long was your piece?
I mean, this is a good 1,600 word piece,
right?
And I think the Butina case elevates the story because it shows how widespread the Russian infiltration is. It's not just for the presidential election. There's a deeper operation afoot to infiltrate the conservative movement in the Republican Party. But I then say towards the end of the piece, the contemporary figure that most closely parallels Hiss is not Butina, but Donald Trump. And when Mark Levin read the lion's share of the article on air, he skipped over that part.
All right, well, let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, so Alger Hiss was a Russian spy. I think most of us now agree that is the case.
He still has defenders.
And he was in the media, though. He had infiltrated. He was a prominent media figure, right? Was it Time Magazine?
Well, no. Well, Chambers.
I'm confusing him with Whittaker Chambers.
Yeah. So Hiss was part of FDR's early administration.
Right. He was at Yalta.
That's later.
Okay.
He started he was almost, I think, at the beginning in the agricultural division, which was sort of a hotbed of lefty politics. And in Arthur Schlesinger's history, essentially there was an underground communist cell that was centered in the agricultural division. That most of those folks later got purged, but Hiss survived, and he later went over to Justice and then to State, and he rose very high. I think most of his time in the Roosevelt administration at State, and that carried over into the Truman administration, and eventually, he's there at Yalta. In the Republican telling of this story, or say the conservative telling of this story, Hiss was the major player of Yalta. I don't subscribe to that. And there's a conservative narrative, which is Roosevelt sold us out at Yalta. Roosevelt gave up Poland at Yalta, and that's what supercharged Stalin, and we could have constrained him if we had a tougher line there. And one part about Yalta, which is not as well known, is they discussed the UN at Yalta, the beginning of the UN, and Stalin wanted extra votes for himself. He wanted to get nation status for several of the Soviet satellites, so he would have more votes to play with in the General Assembly. And Hiss opposed that. So just one example of Hiss not always doing what the Soviets wanted. Now, I'm not saying Hiss wasn't an agent. I think the evidence is that he was.
Right.
But after Yalta, they have the UN conference where they finalized the charter where 50 nations were present. Hiss didn't run the entire show there. That was largely run by the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius. But Hiss was the Secretary General of the UN for that conference. So he handled a lot of the administrative aspects of the conference. That's how high up he rose in the Roosevelt Truman administration.
Very alarming, obviously,
yes.
to have the high upper echelons of our government, diplomatic part of our government infiltrated by a foreign spy.
Absolutely.
Or a spy working for a foreign government. No, so let's go with your stated point, which is that Donald Trump is somehow like Alger Hiss. Isn't that a bridge too far?
Well, let me before we jump there, let's get some of the finer points of the Hiss story down for folks who don't know.
Well, and as you know, I'm clearly, as I've demonstrated here today, an expert on this, but for the sake of the listener. So
after the UN conference, I mean, Hiss literally hand delivers the charter to Truman. That was one of his roles, and it was actually in like its own little parachute. So in case the plane went down, like the charter would be saved. And this is a bit of a digression, so excuse me. He expects this big ceremony when he gets to the White House for the presentation of the charter, and he walks in the Oval Office to see Truman in shirt sleeves drinking a bourbon, and he's deflated that this is not more of a regal ceremony. But shortly after that, Whittaker Chambers was a communist in the 30s, was working with the Soviets, and he left the Communist Party in the mid to late 30s, and he starts talking about the people he knows in government who are associated with the communists and the Soviets, and he tells certain people that Hiss is a Soviet, works for the Soviets, and people kind of shrug it off, and he thinks nobody cares. So he doesn't push it super hard. He gets a job at Time magazine. At one point, he even writes an article, I think it was about the UN conference, where he says nice things about Hiss. And so that's sort of used against him later. Like, well, you thought he was a Soviet agent, why you say nice things about him? But in 1948, he goes totally public. Actually, it's before 1948. There's already FBI investigation of Hiss that the Secretary of State at the time knows, Jimmy Burns, and the Undersecretary Dean Acheson knows. I don't think it's not necessarily true that Truman knew, but other folks knew. The rumors are enough that Hiss gets nudged out of state, but he does so in an elegant way, like with a soft landing at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And that's partially engineered by a Republican, John Foster Dulles, who then becomes a big shot in Eisenhower's administration later on. So his reputation is still good and this is 46 when he is nudged out. 48, Chambers testifies to the House Un-American Activities Committee, fingers Hiss as a communist. This is a massive spectacle. And Hiss goes to the committee the next day to defend himself. It says he doesn't even know who Chambers is. Later, there's a confrontation that's orchestrated by folks on the committee where Hiss admits, "Oh, I knew this guy, but he was running under an alias. I didn't know he was going up by George Crossley." So this, then several months after that, Chambers brings people to his farm where he says he has papers that Hiss gave him to give to the Soviets that he hid in a hollowed-out pumpkin. They're known as the Pumpkin Papers. And that becomes a huge sensation. And then by 1950, there were two perjury trials. One was a deadlock jury, and the second one, Hiss is convicted of perjury. There's no statute of limitations. He could get charged for espionage, but he's charged for perjury for lying about his interactions with Chambers. Hiss spends 44 months in jail, spends the rest of his life, 42 years, maintaining his innocence. And wrote a book. There's all kinds of industry of Hiss defenders, and of course, and Chambers defenders. Chambers writes his own book called Witness. Shortly before Hiss dies at the age of 92, there are Soviet intercepts that were intercepted by the U.S. that were declassified that strongly suggests Hiss was an agent. So that's sort of considered the final word by most people. And you listen to Hugh Hewitt's show, that's sort of a standard question of his when he has a liberal on or a member of the media on. Do you believe Hiss was a communist spy? And if you say no or you hedge, he then shreds your credibility because this should be beyond a shadow of the doubt after these papers from the 90s were revealed.
Has Hugh weighed in on Bill Schergate?
I mean,
the controversy.
I called out Hewitt directly in my piece because here's a guy who has been obsessed about Alger Hiss for his whole career. Says it's proof of communism running rampant in the Roosevelt administration. It's the origin of the New Deal. We shouldn't trust the Russians because this is what they do. Yet he has flack for Trump. Throughout. I think a bit of hesitation early on, but he came out strong for him by the end. Defended him against charge that he was compromised by the Soviets, by the Russians. And then after this spectacle, he's not happy with what Trump did.
Yeah.
He expressed.
Let me tell you my take on Hugh. I know Hugh just a little bit. Very nice guy. He actually wrote the foreword to Too Dumb to Fail. But my take on him is I think he decides what he's for. And that decision is a pragmatic decision, right? It's let's say like Trump versus Hillary. He would say like, well, all right, I guess I'm for Trump. It's a binary choice. I'm going to be for Trump. Once he makes that choice, I think he then retrofits every argument into defending Trump as if he were his lawyer. Mm-hmm. You're a lawyer. And so in a way, you're sort of putting blinders on. You're doing your duty. I think that's the way he constructs arguments.
I'm going to be more charitable than you.
Okay.
Because he's not. If he was being his lawyer, like there would be no criticism at all. It would be more like a Sean Hannity, like nothing to see here. I think I agree with you. I mean, Hewitt has called himself a partisan journalist. So it's not like he's denying that that's his goal is to advance, Republican ideals and policies. And he's very focused on judges, supremely focused on judges. So he's very, very happy about Kavanaugh, and he's pushing, and the lower court judges are pushing. In fact, he's complaining that McConnell's not going fast enough to get the judges through the process. So I certainly see him. Let's not cut off Trump at the knees here. We're getting the judges that we want.
Right.
At the same time, he's really focused on Putin. He's really focused on Russia. He knows he can't just pretend this isn't happening. So he tweets on that day, or the day after, this is the worst day of the Trump presidency. I pray this is the worst day of the Trump presidency. and sort of we'll get past this. And he said on his show, I had hope, Putin played Bush and played Obama. I hope Trump would have handled him better, and I'm disappointed that he didn't. So, and it's sort of on the lines of what you were saying last week about sort of strength and weakness, that they were weak towards Putin. People like Hewitt, people like Lindsey Graham were saying Trump will be strong with Putin. Oh, he wasn't. Oh, that's sad. I'm sad he wasn't strong, and he got played. You know, it's all about sort of his failings as a person, and it's short of Trump agrees with Putin on main foreign policy issues and is actively supporting his ends.
I don't know if Hugh said this, but I heard several people talk about how Helsinki was a, quote, missed opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a, I mean, it's, you could say, I mean, I guess you could say like that a car crash was a missed opportunity to drive to work safely. I mean, okay.
Well, but but that's assuming you had a honorable objective of driving to work safely.
Right.
I mean, my point is Trump's objective here is not honorable. It's manifestly the case that
I don't think we know that. I think
we do. I will concede. I don't know if there was a crime committed. I don't know if Trump broke the law during the campaign. It could well be that all the activity was sort of Russia one way, and Trump and his team not knowing what to do with that. But just on a policy basis, Trump is on record saying things that are in sync with what Putin says.
Okay. I mean, but there's different arguments for why that might be. It could be that he is compromised. It could be that he believes that any talk about Russian meddling impugns his electoral victory, and he's thin-skinned. It could be that he sees the real threat to civilization as being radical Islamism, and he views Russians as a partner in this great effort. I mean, these are all bad, misguided reasons, but they don't all suggest that he is in league with Putin per se, like in a nefarious way.
Well, I can't know what the exact motivation is of him. If this is strictly policy basis, is it because of compromat? Is it because they got manipulated? I mean, that I don't know. I know two things. One, Trump literally echoes the Putin line almost whenever given the opportunity, with a handful of instances where he goes the other way just to kind of make things confusing. But literally, he's on stage with Putin, and they're singing from the same song sheet in open view. Like, that's a fact.
Let me tell you a couple.
But number two, the Butina case shows that there is a Russian operation to infiltrate Republican and conservative institutions to influence foreign policy and to make America more in line with Russians' foreign policy interests. Those two things are facts. I don't know what's chicken or egg here, but if you are somebody like Hewitt who is saying Russia is bad, our policy should not be in sync with Russian policy, we should be confronting Russian policy, not abetting it, and you are not recognizing the two facts that I just said, you are not achieving your own goal of stopping of having a Republican Party that is a bulwark against Russian policy. And so the end of my piece. So Hewitt's a guy that says, "Oh, this is not so good," but let's not talk about it too much. I mean, Hewitt is also complaining that the Justice Department issued these indictments of Russian officials before the meeting because that's them getting out of their land and going into foreign policy. He's certainly not dwelling very much on the Butina case, and he's shifting focus to the judges because he wants to get back to the stuff that he wants.
Well, I think he has an agenda. Right. I think he has decided that the best thing for America, the best thing for conservatism, and I think he sees those two things as being the same, is for the judges thing to happen, and let's just try to manage Trump. Not a crazy, if you're a conservative, not a crazy place to come down. But then I think that once he has that agenda, he will then frame his commentary around that end justifies the means prism. And again, I like him, think he's a smart, good guy. Not how I view journalism, not how I view my role of journalism. I mean, we're in a little bit, I'm an opinion journalist, he's an opinion journalist, but he's a talk radio host. I mean, he does MSNBC. I mean, we're not in exactly the same space, but I think clearly we view our role as differently. And I'll also say this, it is interesting. A couple of years ago, I was a frequent guest host of Hugh Hewitt's radio show, as was Jamie Weinstein. Now, let me just state, I have no desire to host a radio show that starts at 6 a.m. This is not sour grapes. But the last time I heard somebody was guest hosting for him, it was Seb Gorka. So he went from Matt Lewis and Jamie Weinstein to Seb Gorka. I don't know what that tells you, but I think it tells you something.
So to that end, I mean, I mentioned this in the piece I wrote at Politico. So it's one thing to say, look, let's look at this in terms of short-term politics. You never get everything that you want. Sure, I don't like what Trump's doing with Russia, but I want to get the judges, I want to get the tax cuts, I want these other things. So let's focus on what we can get because life's imperfect. I mean, that's not an irrational approach to politics and life. However, if your belief is that what Russia is doing is horrible and toxic and threatening to Americans' democracy, which I think Hewitt has often literally certainly suggested in his obsession with Alger Hiss and such. That might be an overriding concern. And if you lionize Whittaker Chambers, as many of the folks on the right who focus on Alger Hiss do, I mean, Chambers was someone who said at the time that not only was Hiss a communist agent, but that the whole liberal project of Roosevelt and Truman was a front for socialism, that this was the ice cap of socialism inching over America. And so if you are going to lionize Chambers for those things, you got to read all of his words. And one of his main points, he said this in his House testimony, he said it in the book Witness, that when he left the Communist Party in the 30s, he felt he was leaving the winning world for the losing world.
Yeah.
But it was better to die than to live under communism. That's how important he saw it. I mean, he nothing was a given that American capitalism and democracy was going to defeat Soviet communism, but he just couldn't abide by it anymore. Yeah. So if your attitude is, oh, well, Trump's not good on Russia, but man, the base likes him, and he got in there with whatever he did, he got there, and he's getting us stuff. You are prioritizing being in the winning world than doing what you think is right for American democracy, and you are most certainly not following the example of Whittaker Chambers.
Hey, I wanted to bring up a couple of experiences I've had lately that I found interesting, because they suggest the theory that Trump, possibly influenced by Melania, views Russia as an ally, like not in a nefarious compromat way, but in a misguided us against them and their us way. So the first thing that happened is I got an email from a regular reader who's very nice and smart, I've corresponded with, and she was telling me that and you know more about this than I do, Bill, but my sort of internet research confirmed some of this, that you know, the Serbian, you know, Milosevic stuff, where NATO essentially sided with Muslims against Christians. Now, the Christians were committing genocide against the Muslims, but that Putin really latched onto that and viewed that as sort of a red line that America and that NATO crossed in the 90s. That might explain part of why he hates the Clintons so much. and that Melania coming from that part of the world may be influencing Trump in that direction. The other thing that happened to me is just anecdotally, I was hanging out. I have some friends who live in France that I've been friends with for almost 20 years. And I was spending some time with them recently. And they are, I don't want to say they're pro-Putin or pro-Russia, but they're pro-Putin. They're pro-Putin and pro-Russia. I mean, they'll say, yeah, he's a bad guy, and we shouldn't fully trust him. And of course, he's got his own interests, but he is advancing conservative values in his country, and he is an ally against radical Islam. These friends of mine are very concerned about what is happening in France, where, of course, you've got a large influx of Muslim immigrants in there. And, they're worried about completely changing the culture of France, which I think that it's, if you're worried about what's happening in America with, these Hispanic Catholics coming in here, imagine the culture shock that you would have in France. And it was eye-opening because, again, these are people that I've known for a long time, and it just made me think that, there is this idea that Russia, and we've seen it with, the first time I heard about it was like 2013 or something. It stunned me, honestly, the first time I heard conservatives saying good things about Vladimir Putin. It freaked me out and blew me away. But there is this strain out there of people who say, like, look, Russia, we may have had our differences in the past, but like, this isn't like the left versus right anymore. This isn't, they're not communists anymore. This is like, and by the way, since when is Russia Western civilization? I don't even buy that. But in their mind, this is Western civilization versus, radical Islamism. That is the defining issue of our day. And in that struggle, they're on our side. It's possible that Trump views things through that prism. And I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but it's different than him being compromised or co-opted by Putin.
Right. I don't necessarily believe that, Putin has the P tape and that's why this is all happening. That seems very pat and conspiratorial to me. Julia Ioffe, who I forget where she was at the Atlantic. I forget where she is now. I want to say Time, but I could be getting that wrong. But she made a point. Where was she? Maybe it was GQ. I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
And she's Russian.
She's Russian.
From Russia.
She's from Russia. She's a Russian expert. She said the compromise probably isn't, something gossipy. It's the election itself. The fact that Russia was needed to help Trump get there, and if they pulled their support, then maybe you wouldn't be there anymore. Like that was the compromise. I'm not saying I think that's the whole story, but I'm just saying there's other theories out there what compromise really means.
I mean, I guess my point is, like, look, it's possible that there's compromise. Then it's also possible that Trump just loves authoritarians and dictators. It's possible that Putin is just outmaneuvering him and is smarter than him. It's not even possible, likely. There's a lot of possibilities here, and one of them might be that this Trump has this worldview, and possibly influenced by Melania, which that's a different angle. I haven't heard anybody else bring that one up, right? And I'm not saying that it's right, but there's a lot of people are saying, like, this is evidence that Donald Trump is a Russian spy. Like, no.
Well, and I think we don't have to get into, we don't have to speculate. There's enough on the record, to your point, that I mean, you're saying maybe Trump has this authoritarian worldview. He's expressed it. It's on record that he believes that we should not impose our human rights standards on other countries, not just Russia, but also Saudi Arabia and the like. That's out of our lane. And if Russia wants to help us fight ISIS, great. Everything else is secondary from that. I mean, he has expressed that directly, and that is very much in line with this. I mean, there's sort of two, and this is not just about conservatism, but I think there are two strains that you're sort of getting at here. One is what Hugh Hewitt articulates, which is we need to defend American democracy, and Russia is antithetical to that, both in its Stalinist form and its Putinist form. They've been anti-democratic, and therefore they should be resisted. The other strain, this is the more Pat Buchanan strain, is the Cold War is over. This is not about capitalism versus communism anymore, because communism doesn't exist in Russia. They have embraced God. Putin is, they're no longer an atheist country. Putin has elevated the church in Russia. They've resisted gay rights in Russia, and they're on our side in the great Titanic struggle against Islam. So they are our effective ally, and we should treat them as such. Now, Trump, if you read the Jonathan Chait piece, I've not read the whole thing, I just know the outlines of it. Chait's argument was that the Russians had Trump as a mark from the late 80s on. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was like literally a Soviet agent, but just that they've been working him for a long time. Not even knowing he was going to be president someday, just that they try to find people who are going to be nice to them in America, and they do what they can with them. And this is at the tail end of the Cold War, where Trump might have been recognizing, oh, there's a business opportunity for me here in Russia. I see that glasnost is happening, perestroika is happening. Let's get on the ground floor. He had already expressed his nationalist sensibilities in his op-ed in the Times in '87, where he talked about other countries, eating our lunch, talking about trade protectionism, and that sort of feeds into the 1990s era divisions with Clinton's use of NATO in Serbia, which Russia didn't like. You could see that all coming together, where Trump has internalized that Russian political worldview, which is America should not be acting on the global stage on the basis of human rights and interfering with other countries' sovereignty. So, I mean, I think that there's enough on the record about that to make that case. You don't have to get into the conspiratorial stuff.
Yeah, it could be any number of reasons why he went over to Helsinki and took Vladimir Putin's side against his own intelligence agencies. So, I mean, it's bizarre, but, there's multiple different, reasons why he's behaving the way he's behaving.
Let's shift gears for a little bit. We're going to get a lot of time, but I want to talk a little bit about Georgia, because a lot of focus on how Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State, beat Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle, and Trump getting a lot of credit for that. Trump came with a late endorsement. I just saw the tracking polls that happened after the endorsement, and Kemp soars and Cagle crashes. And look, I have no reason to question that the Republican Party is, in effect, Trump's party at the moment. So I'm not discounting that. But there's two things I would point out. One, there's a huge separate factor in the Georgia race, which is that Casey Cagle was exposed on another leaked tape where, because this was a runoff, one of the also-rans in the first round had a meeting with Cagle afterwards where Cagle was extraordinarily candid and said that because this other guy was complaining that Cagle backed an education bill that he opposed, and that Cagle should have known better, this was bad policy. And Cagle was like, oh, I know it was bad policy, but I had to back it because there was a special interest funder out there that was going to give to another opponent if I killed it. So I made sure it got passed, and so I cut off that guy's source of funding. That's how the game is played. Let's all be big boys and girls here. And he also, in a second portion of the tape, he complains that the primaries become who's the craziest? Who loves Trump the most? Who loves their guns the most? Which is how Brian Kemp had been running his race. So he's insulting Republican voters, Trump voters, and showing that he backs legislation he doesn't believe in just for his own personal gain. I mean, that softened him up a lot before Trump came in and plunged in the final knife. So I think there's some specifics to the story here that are important. And just because Trump can play well in a primary doesn't mean that Trump plays well in a general. He couldn't get Roy Moore over the finish line. He couldn't get Saccone over the finish line against Conor Lamb. So now the question is, here we are in Georgia. It's a Trump state, but it's been trending blue. Hillary actually improved upon Obama's performance in Georgia in 2016. It's got a healthy African-American population. It's got some upscale, college-educated white population. Can the Democratic nominee, Stacey Abrams, who's more of a traditional liberal, she's not Democratic socialist, but she's liberal, and African-American, can she juice that Democratic base that's sort of trending in the right direction for Georgia over a guy who's hard right? Can she win enough of the middle to win in Georgia? That's the big test right now. If that's the case, Trump's influence in the party is not a good thing because it's harming their ability to get their nominees actually across the finish line in the general.
So, you mentioned that this is all sort of, I guess, a warm up to the midterms and speculation about what can we glean from this that might tell us about the midterms. And I'm starting to wonder about this. On one hand, I feel like, if you're a conservative, you want your judges. Maybe the good news is it looks like Republicans probably hold on to the Senate, but maybe we should be rooting for Democrats to win the House, as a check and balance. And in the past, in the Reagan years and the Clinton years, divided government were very good. On the other hand, I just heard some people on CNN yesterday. I hadn't thought about this. Remember Trump tweeted that the Russians wanted Democrats to win or something that sounded crazy? I heard these people saying maybe the Democrats actually might want. Maybe the Russians might actually want the Democrats to take the House, right? Because if their goal is to stir up division in the country, then wouldn't impeachment hearings be productive for them?
I don't think that's quite right.
Have you heard this?
Garrett Graff, who used to be my editor at Politico, he moved on, but he still writes from Politico from time to time. He wrote a piece along those lines, which I think Trump didn't cite directly, but perhaps informed the tweet he gave on that subject. I think so. And the point being, this isn't necessarily Trump's point. Trump was trying to say, I'm tough on Russia, therefore Putin wants Democrats, which is total nonsense. Garrett Graff's point was that Putin wants chaos, and having Democrats take the House and do what you said would have more chaos. I would take that argument one step farther, because I don't think I think the Butina case shows that the Russians feel closer to the Republican Party than the Democratic Party right now. And I have a hard time seeing how they would find the Democratic Party would ever be as favorable to them as Trump is being to them at this present moment. So I don't think they want that to change. I think they do want to sow chaos within the Democratic Party. They like this divide between the Democratic Socialists and the establishment. And while, Bernie, for example, is not being pro-Putin at all, so I'm not tarring with a broad brush here, there are some on the far left which play the pro-WikiLeaks, America's the hegemonic monster, everything is secondary to that, so let's not get mad at Putin and Assange for exposing the truth about Americans' foreign policy. That strain exists on the left. And I think Putin would like to see that divide be exacerbated in the Democratic Party. So I would not be surprised if he elevates the farther left candidates as much as possible in hopes of sort of that division. Now, I'm trying to say this to be delicate because I don't want to be McCarthyite here. Bernie is not pro-Putin. So I'm going to be very clear about that. He has been very critical of Putin's involvement in 2016, and he stayed on that. So it would not be fair to say if there's a Russian smear campaign that benefits, let's say, Ocasio-Cortez, just as a hypothetical. Now, I've not heard Ocasio-Cortez say anything nice about Putin whatsoever. Maybe I missed something, but I'm not aware of it. If Russia came in to help her beat Joe Crowley on the working families ticket, in case that actually kicks him to a thing, that doesn't mean that Ocasio or Cortez, cultivated it or encouraged it. But she would run a risk of being tarred by it if she wasn't careful.
You know who he could get behind? Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of person. He would love to have a Gabbard-Trump race because then it's a win-win for him. So I don't think most Democrats are in the Gabbard camp, even on the left. So I think if you are on the socialist populist left, I do think you want to be extra careful. If they are getting into your race, you want to be firm. I want none of this.
Bill, maybe this is a column. Maybe this is your next column.
Maybe. I mean, I don't think we're there yet because I haven't seen it actually happen. I'm being extraordinarily speculative. But if we see it,
what business are we in, Bill? We're talking about it.
I think if we do see it, I think you want to watch who exactly does Russia try to help. And so I would not immediately assume if he helps one Democrat, he means he wants to help all Democrats. And if he is helping a certain Democrat, I wouldn't assume that Democrat wants that help. So go on.
I agree. Let me ask you this. The other part of my theory is that divided government can be very good. Has been, except in the Obama years. It certainly was not healthy. Is it possible that if Democrats... is it possible that if Democrats take control, they would simultaneously check the president and yet be willing to make deals with him? Or would there be too much pressure on them to not give him any wins, to not do what Tip O'Neill and Reagan did and what Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich did?
The 2020 campaign starts on November 9th, 2018. People are going to be announcing their candidacies almost right away.
Right.
There is extraordinarily little incentive for Democrats to help Trump in any way. Now, let's say Trump puts a fat infrastructure bill on the floor. You're going to deny people jobs because you hate me? That's a bad look.
So why did it work in 94? Why did it work in 86 or whatever?
Well, two different situations. So 96, Bill Clinton ran on welfare reform in 92. So Gingrich cornered Clinton. You said you were for this. I'm putting it on the table. Clinton was resisting it because it wasn't the kind of welfare he knew was far to the right than he really wanted. But he also knew at the end of the day, if I veto this...
But why were Republicans willing to work with him, right? Couldn't they have said, let's not give Bill Clinton any wins because he's on the ropes. We just took back the House for the first time in 40 years. Bob Dole's going to be the next president. Let's not give Bill Clinton anything. Couldn't they have? Why didn't they do that?
Perhaps they should have. I'm not. Maybe Gingrich just talked about this on the record. I'm not aware of off the top of my head. Maybe he thought Clinton wouldn't do it, and Clinton, called his bluff. Maybe he did it because he thought it was the right policy and thought it was a chance to get the policy. I'm not sure, but I think in retrospect, it helped Bill Clinton in '96 to sign that bill.
Definitely.
Regardless of how good the bill was and how what's it done for poor people since then, politically speaking, that was a positive for Bill Clinton. That confirmed the Dick Morse triangulation theory of the game, which, as much as it's hated by the left now, worked for Bill Clinton in 1996. For the taxes, this is Reagan's second term now. So he's already passed re-election. He's looking for a legislative legacy. it's still a largely Democratic body in Congress. I think Reagan always had a compromising bent because what else are you going to do? They got a lot of Democrats in Congress. You can't get anything done without Democrats. And I think they thought this was as good a deal as we're going to get, which was a mix of increases and decreases because you were going to lower that top rate. And
so
that
I
was
guess
the big
the
thing that they
question
wanted.
is, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that there was a time when divided government was very effective at positive public policy results.
I wouldn't take it
but
that
those
far.
days are over. I
wouldn't take it quite that far because I think history shows you get a lot more done with one-party rule and two-party rule. There's been a lot of gridlock in the history of two-party rule. The Republicans screwed Wilson on the League of Nations, and Truman ran against the Do-Nothing Congress in '48 because the Republicans were stalling his fair deal thing. So it's not like gridlock's never happened before with two-party government. I do think that the parties used to be more ideologically heterodox, and so when there was something to do, you could find a way on certain big important things. I mean, that's more 86 than 94. 94 is more, I think, just partisan chess game that one side called the other side's bluff. But yeah, it's a lot harder now because the parties are more ideologically purified, and so there's less common ground to be had. And I think it's going to be particularly hard to do with Trump because he's such a loathed figure on the left, and that presidential race is going to be in full gear very quickly.
Well, I guess there's nothing to be excited about or optimistic about. So there they go.
But if you want to have a legislative check on Trump, and if you want to have more inquiry into his dealings by a body of Congress, you want a Democratic House. If you don't want Trump's judges to get blocked, you don't want that to extend to the Senate. So that's why for people in your camp, it's a fine line to draw. You don't want to whip up Democrats too much because that might actually give them the Senate. Well,
that's where I was sort of coming down, but now I'm worried about the Russians liking this idea of chaos and the what having like the impeachment proceedings and all that stuff could. Are we playing into the Russians' hands with that? And
I don't think the Russians care about legislative gridlock. I don't think that. I mean, America has had a House and Senate from different parties before, and American democracy can overcome that very easily. I don't think that's enough of an incentive for Russia. They want Americans to distrust their institutions, distrust that democracy works in their country, and they want Americans themselves to vehemently dislike each other.
Well, the good news is Don Beyer is going to win no matter what Matt Lewis does.
You're sure that your congressional Democratic. He's the incumbent Democrat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know your congressman.
Of course, Bill. What? I'm an American, right?
All right,
what country do you think this is anyway?
We've gone for an hour, Matt. So,
all right.
What do you got?
Well, I do want to. The podcast, Matt Lewis and the News, is really kicking butt. A lot of good shows lately, but the most recent one is The Rise of the Alt-Right. Thomas J. Main. If you were interested in the alt-right, fascinating discussion. So I read the book and I could tell he knew what he was talking about because I agreed. Everything I knew, I totally agreed with him on. But then I also learned new stuff that I didn't know. So we had a really good conversation on the podcast. Matt Lewis and the News. Check that out. And also, I've just had so many cool, interesting people on lately. Dan Abrams came on to talk. Did we talk about this, Bill? He was on a couple weeks ago.
I think you mentioned that one.
The book about Abraham Lincoln, his murder trial, and just really cool guests. So check it out. How about you, Bill?
I haven't done the interview yet, so scheduling can always get changed. But my plan is for early next week to have at the New Books and Politics podcast at the New Books Network, Annie Lowry and her new book, Give People Money: How a Universal Basic Income Would End Poverty, Revolutionize Work, and Remake the World. This is one of the hot ideas churning in Democratic Party circles, although not been embraced by the Bernie crew. It's been more of a Silicon Valley idea. But it gets to the question of what is the nature of work, how is American capitalism going to function when things are more automated and there aren't as much work to go around. This is one idea that's being put out there, and she's giving it the full treatment. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
That'll be cool. I'm also supposed to talk to John Meacham about his new book, which is, I've been reading it. It's actually pretty optimistic and well, not optimistic, but it looks at other times in American history where we've had dark times and how we've had leaders emerge to pull us through. And I'm supposed to talk to one of the head writers from The Simpsons.
Wow. About
a new book out about that. So, yeah, fun stuff happening. I love the podcast medium, as you know. It's just so fun to get to have these conversations. And then thank you all for allowing us, to make the big money that we make doing this.
All righty. Always good to talk to you, Matt Lewis on the DMZ.
Always good talking to you, Bill Scher. We'll see you all back here next week.